All right, let's jump right in. Today we're doing a deep dive into ESG scores in India.
ESG.
Exactly. Environmental, social, and governance, those factors. But this isn't just a basic overview.
Okay, got it.
We're going way deeper. We're going to uncover those surprising trends.
The rising trends.
Yep, revealed in a report by Stakeholder Empowerment Services.
Ah, SES. I know them, yeah?
They took a look at the top 100 listed companies in India.
For the fiscal year 2019 to 2020.
You got it. They didn't include those PSU and government banks, though.
Interesting. Makes sense, though, for this analysis, I guess.
They use a pretty robust model, too. Over 2,200 data points, 1,239 parameters. It's impressive, right?
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. 315 questions, even.
Exactly. It's the kind of deep analysis we need for these hidden insights.
Hmm.
So what's the first big takeaway? What's the overall ESG landscape look like in India?
Well, one of the first things that stood out to me was that some industries you might expect to lag behind on environmental factors are actually doing pretty well.
Really? Like who?
Metals and cement, for example.
No way.
Yeah, they scored higher on average than sectors like consumer goods and finance.
Huh. That's fascinating. I would have assumed those heavy industries would be, dragging down the average. What's going on there?
It seems like those stricter regulations and increased scrutiny on those industries have pushed them to, well, step up their game, both in terms of actual environmental performance and how they're disclosing their practices.
Makes you think about the power of regulation, right?
It really does. This is a good example of how those targeted regulations can drive real change.
So regulation seems to be a key factor here. Does the report say anything about how Indian companies are doing overall on ESG compared to, say, global companies? Are they ahead of the curve, behind, or somewhere in between?
Well, they're definitely catching up. They did start a bit later than many global peers.
Okay.
What's holding them back, though, is, well, a lack of standardized and comparable disclosures. Especially when it comes to those environmental and social factors, it makes it really tough to get a truly accurate picture, and to compare performance across companies and industries.
Yeah, that lack of transparency could be masking some real issues. It's like trying to compare financial statements from different countries. You know,
Mm.
they use different accounting standards. It's hard to get a clear picture.
Exactly. And that lack of transparency can be a major headache for investors,
Oh, I bet.
especially those trying to make responsible decisions. It's hard to assess risk and opportunity when the data is patchy and inconsistent.
For sure. So we've got this interesting situation where some industries are exceeding expectations, likely driven by regulation, but then we have this overall lack of transparency that's muddying the waters. What does the report say about the specific ESG factors? Let's start with those policy disclosures.
Okay, so on the surface, things look pretty good.
Oh, yeah.
Scores for policy disclosures were generally high. 60 out of the 100 companies scored 80 or above.
Wow, 80 or above. So Indian companies are at least talking the talk when it comes to ESG.
It seems so, but are they walking the walk? That's the question, right?
Right, and that's where the devil is in the details. Having those policies in place is a positive first step,
Sure.
but it doesn't necessarily translate into action.
Not always. The report suggests that these high policy disclosure scores are likely driven by the regulatory push for disclosures in business responsibility reports.
You mean those BRRs?
Yep, exactly, BRRs. So again, we see the impact of regulation.
Interesting. So companies are good at checking the boxes, but what about their actual environmental performance? What did the report uncover there? So let's get into those environmental specifics. We already heard about those surprisingly high scores from metals and cement, but what's the overall picture?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the average score for environmental factors is much lower, only 48 out of 100.
48. So while some companies are stepping up, there's clearly a lot of room for improvement across the board.
For sure, big time.
What are some of the key areas where companies are falling short?
Well, the report points to inadequate disclosures on some pretty crucial parameters, like energy consumption, renewable energy use, emissions, the big ones,
Right.
water management and waste management too. Basically, many companies just aren't giving enough information, for stakeholders to assess their true environmental impact.
So it's not just about reducing their footprint. It's about being transparent about what that footprint actually looks like.
Absolutely.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But without that transparency, how can investors and consumers actually make informed decisions?
Yeah, exactly. It becomes a guessing game, and that's not good for anyone. It erodes trust, makes it difficult to hold companies accountable.
Speaking of accountability, the report did highlight one company for its stellar environmental performance. ITC Limited. They actually achieved carbon neutrality.
Carbon neutrality. That's impressive.
Yeah, it's pretty big. I'm curious, what kind of magic did they pull off to reach that goal?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? The report doesn't really go into detail about their specific strategies, which, a bit frustrating.
Yeah, I was hoping for more there.
But it does show that carbon neutrality is achievable, even for, large companies in India. Would be fascinating to do a deep dive specifically into ITC's approach, see what lessons we could learn.
Totally agree. Maybe that's our next deep dive. But for now, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the S in ESG. Social factors. What's the story there? Are companies prioritizing people and communities as much as profits?
Well, the average score for social factors was a bit better than the environment at 57,
57. Okay.
but there's still a wide range between the highest and lowest performers. And guess what? We see those same sectors, IT, metals, and cement, scoring relatively higher on social factors, likely due to those, more robust disclosure practices.
Okay, so maybe those industries were just better at telling their story. Or maybe they really are leading the pack when it comes to social responsibility. What do you think?
It's hard to say for sure, without more detailed information, but it does raise an important question about whether good disclosure always equals, good performance. Are they actually walking the walk? Or just talking a good game?
That's a point worth pondering. Now, one thing that really surprised me in this report was the lowest scoring company for social factors. It was from the pharmaceutical sector.
Pharma.
Really? Yeah. That's not an industry I would normally associate with, poor social performance.
I know, right? It totally challenges those assumptions we have. We tend to think of pharma companies as developing, life-saving drugs, contributing to societal well-being. But this finding, well, it suggests there might be some hidden issues beneath the surface.
Definitely a reminder that we can't make generalizations about entire industries. There are always exceptions to the rule. But what specifically were companies lacking in terms of social disclosures?
Well, many companies weren't providing enough information on workforce practices, employee relations, health and safety, stakeholder engagement,
Got it.
cybersecurity as well. These are all, critical aspects of social performance, but they're often overlooked or underreported.
It's like trying to judge a company's culture based solely on its marketing materials. You're only getting a very curated and potentially misleading view. Without that transparency on social issues, it's difficult to truly assess a company's impact on, people and communities.
Absolutely. And it makes it harder for those investors and consumers to align their choices with their values.
Now, there were a few companies that stood out for their transparency, even in an industry not typically associated with, high social risks.
Yeah.
The report mentioned Infosys and Larsen and Toubro Infotech.
Both IT companies, right?
Yes, for disclosing information on fatalities, even though their industry has, a pretty low risk of workplace fatalities.
That's a great example of going above and beyond. Shows a commitment to being open and honest about their social performance, even when it's not always, flattering.
Okay, so we've covered the E and the S. Let's wrap up this part of our deep dive by talking about the G in ESG, governance. This is an area where India Inc. seems to be doing quite well.
Yeah.
So tell me, are Indian companies living up to their reputation for, solid corporate governance?
Well, the data suggests they are.
Okay.
Yeah. The average governance score was a healthy 75 out of 100. Reflects the impact of those regulations and those established governance requirements we have here in India.
So is it a case of companies simply complying, because they have to? Or is there something more going on?
Well, compliance is certainly part of it, but I think it also shows a deeper understanding of how important good governance is. It's not just for ticking those boxes. It's about attracting investors and building long-term value.
Makes sense. But even within governance, there are variations, right? The report mentioned that the banking sector actually had lower scores. Why is that?
Right, yeah. The banking sector scores were a bit lower because the SES model used some additional evaluation parameters, specifically for that industry.
Oh.
Yeah, makes sense when you think about it. The role banks play in the economy and those higher risks.
Okay, so tougher scrutiny for a sector that really needs it. We've covered a lot of ground here talking about those individual ESG factors. But how does it all come together? How does the report kind of synthesize all this data into a picture of a company's ESG performance?
Right, so that's where the concept of ESG footprint comes in. The report categorizes companies into different ESG footprint levels, based on their overall scores,
Got it.
ranging from high to low footprint.
So beyond just the numbers, this footprint, gives us a more qualitative sense of where a company stands, right, on their ESG journey.
Exactly.
What are some of those hallmarks of a company with a high ESG footprint?
Well, companies with a high ESG footprint are the ones going beyond just compliance.
Yeah.
They've integrated those ESG principles into their, core business strategies. They're transparent in their disclosures, proactive in managing risk, and committed to creating that positive impact.
So it's not just about avoiding those negative headlines. Yeah. It's about actively building a better future. Which raises an interesting question for our listener. Where would you place your organization or investments on this ESG footprint spectrum? Are you leading the charge, catching up, or are you lagging behind? It's a question worth pondering. But as we surface from this deep dive into those ESG scores in India, what are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
Well, first and foremost, ESG is not a niche concern anymore. It's becoming a mainstream expectation for businesses
Mhm.
in India and around the world.
And we've seen how regulation can be a powerful driver for both disclosure and action, especially in those industries facing greater scrutiny.
Definitely.
But we've also seen how a lack of that standardized reporting can create a lot of confusion and hinder progress.
Yeah, for sure. Transparency is key. Without that clear, comparable data, it's just really difficult to assess true ESG performance and to make those informed decisions.
So, as our listeners continue their own exploration of this complex and ever evolving landscape, we leave them with a final thought provoking question. Given the trends revealed in this deep dive, what actions can companies and investors take to accelerate India's progress towards a more sustainable and equitable future? It's a challenge that demands our collective attention and action. Until next time, keep diving deep.